As the age of hunters and gatherers faded, ancient cities rose like titans, vibrant centers of culture, commerce, and power. From empires that conquered the jungle, or hidden cities carved from stone, to bustling ports and mountaintop wonders. How did these cities rise? How did they function? And why did they fall? What lessons and warnings lie buried in their ruins? Secrets of the Lost Cities. In the 1st century AD, Pompeii was a thriving Roman city of almost 20,000 people. Founded on the fertile slopes of Mount Vesuvius. For 800 years, its rich soil, river access, and trade routes made it a hub of culture, commerce, and craft. Until fate dealt the city a death blow in 79 AD.
When Mount Vesuvius erupts, it is an event that will devastate not just the city of Pompeii, not just its neighboring cities and surrounding villas. Everything about the area of southern Italy where Pompeii existed will change in this time.
Entombed under 6 meters of volcanic ash, sealed off from the ravages of time, its final moments forgotten for centuries.
Pompeii ended its life when it was flourishing. Everybody at Pompeii, they wake up, they expect to get their bread, go to the market, it's a normal day. And then the sky goes black. Boom, destroyed.
Uncovered 1,500 years later, Pompeii was frozen in time. And as new discoveries surface, what final secrets lie beneath the ash?
Pompeii was not a Roman city for very long. Pompeii was a Roman city maybe for the last 160 years of its life.
In the period before the Romans came to Pompeii, there were people who spoke a language called the Oscan language. These were a group of people who were very much known to the Romans and in fact were allies of the Romans.
Founded by the Oscans between 600 and 500 BC, Pompeii's position near the Sarno River made it a focal point for trade. By 400 BC, the Etruscans added infrastructure, fortifications, and a thriving marketplace. All of it supported by the volcano's rich soil.
Mount Vesuvius provides amazing soil. You can grow anything there. Everything that a city needed, this landscape provided for so many years.
Between 91 and 88 BC, this prosperity gave way to the social wars. Pompeii rose up against Rome, seeking rights to equal citizenship.
In the early 1st century BC, Rome laid siege to Pompeii. Pompeii had taken the losing side during the social wars against Rome, and Rome fought back.
Pompeii surrendered and was absorbed into the Roman Empire as a colony.
And it's at that moment, not through gradual change, not through generational shift, but through the introduction of a military colony that Pompeii will become officially not an Oscan town, but a Roman one.
The Romans rebuilt Pompeii in their own image. New roads, aqueducts, and grand public buildings saw the city flourish.
I think one secret about Pompeii is that it was not completely unique. In the ancient Roman world, it was probably quite wealthy, but it was just any other town.
Pompeii was laid out on a grid plan, which is always a very optimistic statement. When you think about the beginnings of cities and when we investigate them archaeologically, they are somewhat disorganized because people come in and form their households and lanes and bylanes become crooked and ad hoc. And it takes a visionary and powerful authority to not only draw out the lines of an urban configuration, but to make them happen and to keep them clear.
Roman planners looked to ancient grid-based models from the Greeks when designing cities. At Pompeii's heart, two main roads formed the city grid. Via Stabiana ran north to south, linking city gates, while Via del Abbondanza, the busiest street, ran east to west, connecting markets, temples, and the Forum.
And then also the additions of things like an amphitheater as a draw for urban activity. We really can't seem to get away from that monumental spectacle of urban centers. Every city has some kind of performance space or sporting space that is a place for so many thousands of urban inhabitants to come together.
They are now part of the largest and most powerful empire the world has ever seen. After this initial destruction by Rome, they can sort of enjoy the peace and the prosperity that being part of this Roman Empire will allow.
As Pompeii's population grew to nearly 20,000, so did its wealth. But did prosperity lead to complacency in the face of nature's warnings?
People at Pompeii and all over the Mediterranean were very aware of the consequence of earthquakes. Areas that are earthquake-prone also tend to have fertile valleys and watercourses that make them good places for agriculture, and they also tend to expose areas of good building stone and precious metals. So earthquakes are a little bit the price that urban centers pay for an otherwise favorable environment. And humans, being generally optimistic and resilient, keep thinking that it won't happen to them.
We have to remember that Mount Vesuvius hadn't erupted for more than 800 years by the time it's 79 AD. People living in the area probably didn't even realise that there was a volcano in their midst. I think they were so used to the seismic activity that this was really just part of the ordinary everyday fabric of the city and their experience, and they just didn't really take enough notice of it.
17 years before Pompeii's final day, a powerful earthquake struck the city in 62 AD. Buildings that stood for generations crumbled. Streets split open. The once grand villas, temples and public baths lay damaged. Aqueducts and the city's water supply was disrupted. The human toll of the earthquake was profound. Pompeii became a scarred city under repair.
As a result of the 62 earthquake, people modified their construction techniques.
Whatever they could reuse, they did reuse. There's no point in discarding a wall stone when you can just slap some more cement on that wall stone and put it back up and make a new wall. If it could be reused, it was.
Public structures had the column bases reinforced and then anchored to the street with bronze pins or lead pins, and even private households had a new kind of brick and concrete revetment put in.
Pompeians spent nearly 2 decades rebuilding. The warning had come, but the true lesson was lost. As the Roman renewal of the city continued, daily life for Pompeians carried on. The city ran its own affairs under Roman law.
So Pompeii runs according to this duumviri system. These 2 senior magistracies, they're called the duumvirs, literally the 2 men, and they're elected annually, and they oversee the major civic infrastructure. And they're then supported by 2 junior magistracies known as aediles. They're in charge of things like public entertainment from the games, but also to maintaining the streets.
Pompeian society was strictly hierarchical, and the city's urban plan reflected that. But not quite as one might expect.
The neighborhoods are very, very interesting. There was zoning, but was there like a socioeconomic zoning? Not really as much as maybe in the present day, where we have wealthy neighborhoods and impoverished neighborhoods. In Pompeii, just look at the architecture and the houses. Absolutely fantastic houses, enormous, almost as big as a city block, next to, we can say, middle-class houses.
Though the contributions of Pompeii's poorer classes are largely lost to history, their communal way of life holds important lessons.
The lower class houses are fascinating for a number of reasons. They are smaller. They're probably packed in a lot of people. There's many of them packed in one city block, but also the difference in how they functioned is very clear. They used it as industrial processing plants, as commercial ventures. So it wasn't just a domestic space, it was a commercial space, it was an industrial space. They're going to use this in every single way that they can in order to make a living.
Insulae, Latin for islands, were Pompeii's apartment blocks. Often 5 stories tall, they crammed in 30 to 50 working-class residents, living in tiny units of just 1 or 2 rooms. They were built above street-level shops or workshops. Skilled artisans powered Pompeii's economy. Metalworkers, potters, and weavers turned raw materials into valuable goods.
We find ourselves in a dyeing workshop, of which there are about 6 or 7 in Pompeii, and these were used for dyeing wools and textiles, sort of the raw wool, and people would bring them here and they would go in these big basins. So these basins are actually lined with metal so that they can boil them up with the dyes, and so that fixes them in place.
In Pompeii, most women were expected to marry, raise children, and manage the household. But even with the strict Roman patriarchy, some women owned property, ran businesses, and lived with surprising independence.
There is an apartment building called the Prydia of Julia Felix. We have a notice outside of her building advertising rooms for rent. And so we can see really that women too could play a role. They could be wealthy. They could have control over their economic lives. They had a modicum of power and independence.
Like the rest of the Roman Empire, Pompeii's commerce, industry, and daily life ran on slavery.
There's one excavation that just recently took place 500 meters north of Pompeii. It was a fantastic villa. A very elite person owned it. But what was really interesting is one of the rooms, and it seems to have been quarters for enslaved workers. We absolutely know that enslaved peoples were a huge part of the population at Pompeii and everywhere in the Roman Empire, but we can't see them. They're not written about. They don't leave behind an archaeological record. And really, this is great because it is so rare to get an idea, to get an image, to get evidence of how enslaved people lived, even though they literally were maybe 30% of the population.
There is evidence that upward mobility for enslaved people wasn't impossible.
In Pompeii, it's possible for sub-elites to aspire to the highest echelons of society, but all of this is totally predicated on the accumulation of wealth. The House of the Veti is one of the largest and most lavish residences in Pompeii, and it's probably owned by 2 former slaves.
This rise from slavery to luxurious wealth exemplifies the complexities of social mobility. But status was just one part of Pompeii's intricate story. As archaeologists continue to peel back the city's secrets, Pompeii reveals another: the vital role of water in daily life and culture. Nowhere was that more evident than in the city's public bathhouses.
Most people didn't have access to bathing facilities in their own household, so major public baths were critical to the infrastructure of cities like Pompeii. There's rooms where people would go to sweat, really hot rooms. And there's another room where you could go and have the sweat scraped off you with this bronze implement known as a strigil.
Rich or poor could come and bathe themselves for a small fee of 2 denarii, or even for free on public holidays. Pompeians used an ingenious heating system called the hypercaust to warm bathhouses and elite homes.
The floors of the rooms to be heated are raised on small pillars of tiles, and this essentially creates an airspace beneath the room. This airspace is heated by a wood-burning furnace. This is a really ingenious way to not only heat the room, but also any water that's in the room as well.
But Pompeii's innovations went beyond heated comfort.
At Pompeii, the sewerage system is incredible because we do have these massive sewers underground, meters and meters beneath the city, running southward and leaving the southern end of the city. And these were hooked up to these major public areas, maybe the forum space or the bath complexes. If you were lucky enough to have a house right above the sewer, you could dig a hole and your toilet could be connected directly to these major underground sewers. Other than that, a lot of these houses had septic tanks just outside. We can call these flush toilets. Maybe you get a bucket of water, you throw the water, and that flushes all the waste into that cesspit. Every now and then, periodically, they would be emptied out, cleaned, waiting to be filled up again.
Even today, Pompeii's complex water systems are a remarkable example of ancient ingenuity. Even more impressive is how they kept the city's water flowing.
It's actually coming from an Augustan aqueduct. It's about 40 kilometres away, and it comes into this Castellum Aquae, this large stone-roofed reservoir of water, and from this it's then piped out through 3 main pipes to the rest of the city. And so here it's supplying things like public water fountains, private houses, but also these large bathing complexes as well.
Listed as a World Heritage Site, Spain boasts one of Rome's greatest feats, the 1st century aqueduct of Segovia. It carried water over 15 kilometers without a single drop of mortar, using precision-cut stones held together by gravity alone. This feat of engineering stayed in use for nearly 2,000 years, until 1973. Segovia reveals just how advanced Roman engineering was, but Pompeii reveals the secrets of Roman life.
Pompeii is one of the most fascinating places you can be because it's really one of the only places that you can actually feel like you're really, truly back in the past. You actually feel like you're surrounded by the ancient world. You really get yourself immersed and meshed.
But of course, what makes Pompeii fascinating to us is that it is preserved as a kind of snapshot of daily life. One of the ways that we see this is that we have preserved walls. If you're not an archaeologist, you might not think of that as being particularly remarkable, but I can tell you that most of the time when we excavate in ancient cities, we find only the foundations. In Pompeii, we get the whole house. And so we can see what kinds of decorations people had on their walls.
In the House of the Veti, in the triclinium, or dining room, we see depictions of Roman myths, such as the painting of King Pentheus, who was torn apart by the frenzied female followers of Dionysus, to more playful Cupid frescoes that show cherubs at work, trading, crafting, doing the jobs of everyday Pompeians.
The frescoes provide this really extraordinary glimpse of everyday life in Pompeii, and they present these really vivid scenes from things like banqueting, but also food preparation and commerce. And they're these really tantalising glimpses into the tastes and the cultural aspirations of Pompeii.
Among the scenes of daily life are more provocative images. Explicitly erotic frescoes that reveal a Roman world surprisingly open about sex. They reflect a pleasure-seeking society where power, commerce, and intimacy were deeply entwined, perhaps more open than modern society today.
I think they had a more laissez-faire attitude towards sexuality. It was depicted in the wall paintings and the mosaics, and there were images that we think of as sexual, but actually the Romans thought of them as being protection charms and lucky amulets. So I think we have to try and see through Roman eyes.
More than any lost city on Earth, Pompeii's power is that it wasn't abandoned. It's a time capsule of interrupted lives.
There's frescoes that are being made at the time, like in the house of the painters at work. You can see that there's evidence of people who are literally putting the plaster on the wall and who are painting it at the time. And there's a ladder that's been knocked down. It looks like the people who were working on it have just run out the door.
As the excavations continue, the rhythms of daily life can be seen everywhere. In 2019, the Great Pompeii Project uncovered vibrantly painted snack bars.
These were the world's first fast food restaurants.
This particular bar counter is a great piece of evidence because it is very fresh, it's fully constructed and conserved, and it tells us what many of those others might have looked like, even though they've been partially lost to history.
They're zoning, they're building to make things as convenient as possible, to make things available block by block for different people. You didn't have to walk across town to get your bread. You probably had your own bakery in that vicinity.
Pompeii was ahead of its time. Its 2 stone public theatres were built decades before Rome's first stone theatre. And in 70 BC, it unveiled the Roman world's earliest known stone amphitheatre, whose design is seen by today's crowd control specialists as near optimal.
This is where you would have had gladiatorial fights and games as well as performances. And so it's the kind of place where people from all over Pompeii, but also the regions as well, would have been coming for their public entertainment.
The Roman authorities 2,000 years ago talked about the need for bread and circuses to keep the urban population satisfied.
Outside the amphitheatre, the streets of Pompeii were full of movement and the kinds of daily rituals that feel strikingly familiar even today.
If you think about the street life in Pompeii, it was mainly pedestrians, but there were carts going back and forth all the time. And in fact, in Pompeii, you see those ruts from the wheels ground into the street stones. It was an active street life.
But how exactly did a city like this manage drainage, waste, and people on the move?
There's no traffic signs. There's no parking tickets. There's no guidebooks or maps. It's an entirely archaeological puzzle. You have high curbs that then descend to a stone base, and water then flows down the street in times of rain. And for people to then go from one elevated curb to the other, they set these stepping stones across the street. Sometimes on a narrow street, there'll just be one wide one. Sometimes there'll be as many as 4 making their way across the street.
But managing all this traffic in narrow, crowded streets could be a challenge for the iron-wheeled carts.
The stepping stones in the middle sometimes actually get hit directly. And in some examples, I can see that they had to be going in a particular direction when they hit that corner.
These close encounters between carts and stepping stones reveal a city still figuring itself out.
But what happens is that Pompeii in 79 AD stops. And the rest of the Roman world continues. And so the rest of the Roman world widens their streets, spreads spreads out the water, puts understreet sewerage in, comes up with other solutions for their drainage, which allows them to no longer need stepping stones. And so you don't see them in most of the Roman world after the 1st century CE.
While these streets show us how Pompeians lived, decoding the city's architecture reveals something deeper: what they believed. Faith was etched into the very fabric of Pompeii's public buildings, art, and urban planning.
When you visit today, you see the 79 AD layer, but as a tourist, you have to also imagine beneath your feet are layers and layers and layers of history going back 600 years. It's just incredible.
Religion is central to the ancient city of Pompeii, and you have these major public temples. They're dominating these public spaces like the Forum, temples dedicated to Jupiter, Apollo, and Venus. But then you also have all these kind of monuments that are on the streets, like the altars, and you have the statues and you have the statuettes. These are also in people's homes, and this is where people would worship the prosperity and the peace and the well-being of the household.
Religious belief and politics were inseparable. Magistrates were priests. Laws were declared at temples, and decisions framed as divine will.
The favour of the gods is absolutely essential to the smooth running of the state. So you'll find that major civic buildings are actually next door to temples. And this is because governance and religion are totally interlinked and inseparable.
The Forum was the civic and religious heart of Pompeii, located at the crossroads of the city's main streets.
We have the Forum space right smack dab in the center, and this was a place for economy, for getting together, for catching up with people, for politics, for basically everything. And it was centrally located. It was for the people, and people accessed it.
At the Forum's north end stood the Temple of Jupiter, an imposing symbol of Roman power. The Temple of Apollo, one of the city's oldest religious sites, faced the Basilica, Pompeii's commerce and legal center. And by the harbor, the Temple of Venus watched over wealth and prosperity.
And so you just have this landscape of religion that's absolutely everywhere, and it's really given power by the performance of ritual. We have to remember as well that magistrates are also the priests, and so religion is just permeating every aspect of the city.
But to honor the gods, Pompeians needed to create structures that could stand the test of time.
Why are the buildings, why are the walls still standing in Pompeii? Well, of course, because Mount Vesuvius covered them and preserved them. But it was also the concrete that they used.
Roman concrete, or opus caementicum, was the secret to large-scale buildings.
This concrete was amazing. And the secret to Roman concrete? Vesuvian ash. Something called pozzolana. And this pozzolana, as an aggregate in their concrete, made it absolutely strong. So strong and so famous that it began to be used throughout the Roman Empire.
For centuries, Vesuvian ash was thought to be the only secret behind Pompeii's indestructible concrete. But new research revealed a crucial ingredient: limeclasts, tiny white rocks formed by mixing quicklime into the concrete at blazing hot temperatures. This hot mixing gave Roman concrete a remarkable ability to self-heal. When cracks formed, these fragments reacted with water, sealing the damage from the inside out. This also gave it the ability to bond seamlessly with volcanic tuff, which made it perfect for temples, amphitheaters, and domes.
The best concrete that the world had ever seen. It had a much longer lifespan than modern Portland cement. Right? These walls today, they're 2,000 years old at least.
Roofs were built with wooden beams, and Roman builders used terracotta tiles to regulate indoor temperatures, as they effectively absorbed and retained heat.
The Romans created a whole calendar around the Earth-Sun relationship. A knowledge of where the sun is at any time of the year mattered. It's important to know when you're heading into the sun at its lowest and when you're heading into when the sun is at its highest. The days are longer and it's hotter.
Buildings were oriented to maximize daylight, with courtyards and open atriums designed to harness natural warmth. Because of the Earth's tilt as it orbits, the sun sits low in winter and high in summer. So buildings were angled to catch the warmth when it mattered the most.
And that's why we do see an integration of Roman gridiron planning on an initially organic kind of layout. Because Pompeii doesn't line up exactly north, south, east, and west, but it slightly trends to the northwest. And so we see indeed structures in Pompeii that are built that the window collects the sunlight in the winter when it is the coolest to warm up the structure, but the windows are kept low enough with overhangs in a way that they do not draw in the summer sunlight when it is at its hottest.
In the late 1st century AD, Pompeii had been a city for almost 800 years. With well-planned streets, monumental public buildings, and elegant homes. It was a microcosm of Roman urban sophistication. Local builders innovated and adapted to their volatile world, but some forces were beyond their control.
This classical narrative of decline and fall, it just doesn't work in the case of Pompeii. Really, the city's been sealed up arguably at the height of its power.
On August 24th, 79 AD, the people of Pompeii woke to another prosperous day in their thriving city.
Even though there'd been this huge earthquake in '62, I think by this point the people of the area, perhaps much like the people of the area today, had just become so used to living amongst this that they were totally unprepared.
Around 11 a.m., subtle tremors shook the ground. An hour later, Mount Vesuvius erupted. Towering plumes of ash and gas vented skyward. Visible even from Misenum, 21 kilometers away. Where Pliny the Younger, our only eyewitness, recorded the disaster.
His uncle actually witnessed the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Pliny the Younger was there as well, but he's only 17 at the time. It's this incredibly chilling, very descriptive account of the eruption.
We saw a huge dark cloud rising in the sky, shaped like a pine tree spread out in a kind of umbrella shape. Soon ash began to fall. Even in daylight, it felt like night. People were crying, some were wailing, others praying. Some believed the gods had abandoned them. Finally, we left the town, covered in ash like snow. We looked back and saw a black, terrifying cloud, pierced by fire and lightning, In Pompeii, it's thought the ash and pumice began piling up at 10 to 15 centimeters per hour.
It's pouring out of the volcano and it's pouring onto the roofs of people's homes. There's some seismic activity, and at this point, people are being trapped in buildings. But the worst is yet to come.
"18 hours later, on the morning of August 25th, Mount Vesuvius detonated. Blistering pyroclastic surge of superheated gas, ash and pulverized stone moved towards the city at more than 160 kilometers an hour. Some tried to flee, suffocated mid-step by toxic gases. Others were simply buried alive.
The pyroclastic surges were absolutely devastating. Anyone who's caught in this final stage of the eruption dies.
By dawn on August 26th, Pompeii was no longer a city. It was a graveyard.
But it doesn't get said enough that Pompeii is not actually frozen in time at a normal moment, at a moment in which people were just going about their daily lives. It's frozen after 24 hours of truly horrific experiences of those people. So this matters, of course, because when we think of ancient Pompeii, we think of it as a scientific miracle. But when you think of the tragedy that unfolded, that miracle really mutates in your mind to think about what those people went through.
Many of the bodies found later were still clutching household valuables. Others still hugging their children, loved ones, and pets.
Everybody has their reasons to stay. Everybody has their reasons. It's not just because you were old or invalid. You were protecting your house. You thought it would pass. You thought you were safer inside because it was so terrifying outside.
With facial expressions and clothing still visible. The eruption uniquely preserved the lives and deaths of Pompeii's people in a way no other site can. The contorted postures are not signs of prolonged agony, but a result of the intense heat shock.
What we were left with is essentially these voids in the stratigraphy, or these moulds of the people. In the mid-19th century, archaeologists started experimenting with these voids and inserting plaster of Paris into them and creating the casts of the people recorded in their final moments of death.
There's a lesson that has been taught to people for generations, for multiple thousands of years. And that lesson is about hubris. Get into the minds of the Pompeians in the 1st century AD. This was the pinnacle of civilization. And what happens to them? They are cut down, right? They do not appreciate, they do not understand just how easy it is for things to end.
In 1997, Pompeii was listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But its status was threatened in 2013 due to neglect, poor conservation, looting, and damage from over-tourism. Today, cutting-edge technology is helping turn the tide. A robot dog equipped with LiDAR and 360-degree cameras is venturing where humans can't, uncovering hidden corners of the city in a safer, less invasive way. With innovations like this, the Greater Pompeii Project is working to preserve the city as a testament to both human achievement and the unstoppable force of nature.
I think we have to recognise and realise that the environment just can have this incredibly terrifying force, and that humans are so little in the face of it.
Today, we think that we are at some pinnacle of civilization, and things like this cannot happen to us. We are just as vulnerable today as they were 2,000 years ago.
Today, we have megacities of 100 million people. And over half of all people live inside of a city. Learning from the urban experience of a group of people who went through this terrible and terrifying catastrophe, and then the response of government, the response of an empire to that kind of catastrophe, that's a thing that we can learn about and maybe potentially learn how to do better.